In the municipal archive, there exists a single manila folder, its edges softened by time, its label, typed in fading purple ink, misaligned as if placed in haste. Inside are arrest logs, booking photographs, and typed summaries that do not align in tone with the measured formality of the era. Margins are crowded with penciled annotations in an unfamiliar hand. Dates are crossed through and rewritten. Pages are stapled out of order, as though someone sought to disrupt their own chronology. Near the back lies a photocopy of a neighborhood map, its streets traced in black grease pencil. 6 addresses are circled. Between them, faint dotted lines connect house to house, as though charting a route that no official report describes. On the reverse, a clerk's stamp reads received, but the date has been scratched away with a blade. It is not the content alone that is disturbing, but the way it has been kept. No official case number, no assigned investigator's name. It has been filed between unrelated property tax records, hidden in plain sight for decades. When reviewed today, the folder seems to record something beyond crime, a movement, perhaps, or an order of operations that the city never meant to preserve. Each document is ordinary in isolation: a late-night disturbance report, a listing of items seized from a vehicle, the log of a prisoner transferred between facilities. But when arranged in sequence, a pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that leads inevitably toward the homes marked on that map. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to X Archives, and as you listen, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there now. This is a story best measured against the clock and distance that separates you from it. What happened in Richmond that year cannot be understood in isolation, nor can it be softened by time. It moved from house to house without warning, without a single type of victim, and without the courtesy of leaving a clear trail. It was witnessed but rarely spoken of, recorded but never fully explained. And it began, at least in the official record, with the contents of a single folder, misfiled where it could not be found, until someone went looking. The Briley brothers were born and raised in Richmond's Highland Park neighborhood, an area in the mid-20th century that was neither urban slum nor affluent suburb, a working-class district where familiarity among neighbors was the norm. Their parents, James D. Briley Sr. and Bertha Briley, maintained a home that, from the exterior, matched the expectations of a stable, if modest, American household. James Sr., employed as a machinist, was by contemporary accounts a strong and controlling paternal figure. He was known to impose structure within the household, with clear expectations for obedience. Bertha Briley, described as more reserved, managed the domestic space and the children's daily needs. There was no reported evidence of overt neglect or poverty. Food was on the table, the house was maintained, and the children were kept in school. Yet the balance of parental roles skewed toward James Sr.'s authority. Neighbors would later recall that the father maintained physical and symbolic control over the home environment. Accounts mention that the bedroom the brothers shared was padlocked from the outside at night, a measure presented as disciplinary, but which in retrospect suggested a desire to control not just the boys' movements, but their autonomy. The Briley household was distinctive in another, more public way. It harbored an unusual collection of animals. Among these were snakes, tarantulas, tropical fish, piranhas, and large dogs, including Dobermans. While exotic pets were not unknown in the era, the variety and number kept by the brothers stood out in a quiet Richmond neighborhood. Visitors recalled tanks and cages occupying corners of rooms, and the brothers' particular fascination with the feeding of their snakes, sometimes using live rodents or small animals. This behavior, while not illegal, carried an unsettling undertone in light of later events. Inside, the home was orderly, and the children were clothed and fed. There were no official reports of domestic violence or severe deprivation. Still, the atmosphere was not one of warmth. Several later observers noted an emotional detachment among the boys that may have originated in this early domestic climate. Rules were enforced, but affection was less evident. In public, the Briley brothers presented well. They helped neighbors with small tasks, played with other children, and participated in normal neighborhood life. This visibility, coupled with the family's apparent normalcy, allowed them to blend into the social fabric without drawing negative attention. Privately, however, small behaviors hinted at a fascination with control and the mechanics of harm. Feeding exotic predators became a form of spectacle among themselves. The locked bedroom door suggested either disciplinary strategy or mistrust, its existence noted later in investigative files as a sign of the father's authoritarian oversight. Early adolescent behavior also included minor thefts and acts of mischief, though none that drew sustained law enforcement focus at the time. Highland Park in the 1960s and early 1970s was undergoing gradual demographic and economic shifts. For families like the Brileys, maintaining respectability carried weight. Reputations were important in close-knit neighborhoods. The Briley boys' ability to appear polite, helpful, and self-possessed in public spaces reinforced the perception of a good family, a perception that would later magnify the shock of their crimes. From a clinical perspective, the Briley brothers' early environment exhibits both protective and risk factors. On one hand, they experienced stability, consistent schooling, and parental oversight. On the other, there were controlling domestic practices, a home imbued with predatory animal life, and a lack of evidence. Emotional closeness. These elements coexisted with a cultivated public image of helpful, ordinary young men. The contradiction was complete. A household that could pass as a model of neighborhood normalcy, while behind closed doors, seeds of detachment and latent cruelty took quiet root. The gap between perception and reality, already present in Highland Park, would become the defining feature of the Briley case in the years to come. In the winter of 1971, Highland Park was quiet under an overcast sky. On a January afternoon, a single rifle shot broke that stillness. The origin was a modest two-story home on the same block where the Briley brothers had spent their childhood. The victim was Orleen Christian, a 57-year-old neighbor who had been in her backyard, tending to daily tasks. The shooter, it was later determined, was 16-year-old Linwood Earl Briley. Witnesses first heard the sharp crack of a rifle, followed by the dull thud of a body falling. Christian was found lying near the rear of her home, unresponsive. Initial responders noted no sign of struggle or robbery. She was still wearing her house shoes and apron, suggesting she had been engaged in domestic chores moments earlier. Paramedics confirmed her death on scene. Linwood was in his upstairs bedroom at the time. A .22 caliber rifle was recovered from the room, its barrel recently discharged. The fatal shot had been fired from his window, across the narrow distance separating the two properties. The trajectory and point of impact would become significant in subsequent forensic review. Early statements from Linwood indicated no intent to kill. According to police reports, he claimed to have been target shooting or handling the rifle when it discharged. The first medical assessment did not immediately contradict this. There was some speculation that Christian had suffered a fatal heart attack coincidentally, a theory that slowed the homicide classification. This version of events, combined with the absence of known disputes between Linwood and the victim, led to initial caution in charging. A later autopsy revealed a bullet wound beneath Christian's right arm. The angle suggested a deliberate aim rather than a stray shot, prompting a reassessment of the incident as a homicide. Detectives noted the improbability of such a wound, and being accidental from the described handling of the weapon. In recorded interviews, Linwood offered shifting explanations, at one point suggesting that Christian's death was due to a heart condition exacerbated by the sound of the gunshot. The investigation turned to intent. While no conclusive motive was established, some officers noted Linwood's detached demeanor during questioning. Neighbors recalled previous instances in which he had been seen aiming the rifle from his bedroom window, though these had not been reported at the time. Linwood was tried as a juvenile, the court weighing both the lack of prior felony record and his age. Prosecutors argued for a homicide conviction based on forensic evidence and inconsistencies in his statements. The defense emphasized the absence of motive, framing the shooting as a tragic mishap. In the end, the charge was reduced to involuntary manslaughter. The court accepted that the state had not proven premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, and Linwood was sentenced to a term in a juvenile correctional facility. He would serve approximately 1 year before being released back into the community. Records from the reform school period indicate no major disciplinary incidents. However, staff noted a tendency toward isolation and a lack of remorse when discussing the events that had brought him there. The facility's structure, designed for rehabilitation, may have reinforced Linwood's capacity to adapt superficially to authority while preserving his underlying detachment. During this same period, his younger brother James Jr., J.B., had his own violent encounter with law enforcement, firing on police officers during a vehicle pursuit. Like Linwood, he served juvenile detention time, establishing a parallel track of early armed defiance within the family. Linwood's release after only a year underscored a leniency that would later be viewed as pivotal. The combination of a reduced charge, short detention, and re-entry into the same environment set a precedent of minimal consequence for lethal behavior. Within the structure of the Briley household, outwardly stable, privately controlled, this outcome may have reinforced the belief that serious acts could be absorbed by the system with limited personal cost. In retrospect, the Christian case stands as the first confirmed instance of the violence that would define the Briley name. It also marks the opening of a pattern: targeted harm delivered from a position of detachment, followed by plausible deniability, and concluded with judicial restraint. The cycle begun in January 1971 would repeat, with far deadlier results, less than a decade later. By the mid-1970s, the Briley brothers were no longer simply siblings sharing a household. Small acts of delinquency, petty thefts, unauthorized use of cars, and late-night prowling had begun to link them in a loose, unspoken compact. These early incidents, rarely resulting in formal charges, revealed patterns that would become hallmarks of their later coordinated violence: calculated risk-taking, silent communication, and a preference for swift, overwhelming action. Linwood and J.B., the elder two, often operated as a pair. Neighbors reported seeing them moving together at night, dressed in dark clothing, their movements purposeful but quiet. When break-ins occurred, unlocked sheds emptied of tools, small electronics missing from homes, rumors spread locally, but without concrete evidence, law enforcement could not act. Anthony, the youngest, played a quieter role, sometimes serving as a lookout or driver. Their thefts were selective. Targets were often close to home, chosen for familiarity rather than anonymity. This suggested a comfort operating in proximity to their own identities, a sign of both confidence and disregard for long-term consequence. Sometime before 1979, a fourth figure entered their orbit. Duncan Eric Meekins, a teenager from the neighborhood. Accounts vary on the exact circumstances, but Meekins was younger, impressionable, and eager for belonging. The Brileys' combination of charisma and intimidation drew him in. He was not a blood relative, but soon functioned as one, sharing meals, accompanying them on errands, and eventually participating in criminal acts. Meekins' recruitment served two purposes. Practically, it provided an additional set of hands, someone to run messages or act as a secondary lookout. Psychologically, it signaled a shift. The Brileys were no longer operating solely as brothers bound by family obligation. They had begun to function as a gang with defined roles and an initiation process that was measured not in ceremony but in shared criminal exposure. By 1978 to 79, their activities had expanded beyond opportunistic theft. Burglaries became more aggressive, involving forced entry and, at times, the binding of occupants. Sexual assaults began appearing in police reports, linked by witness description to multiple perpetrators acting in concert. Community accounts described a change in demeanor. Where once the brothers had been perceived as merely rough around the edges, they now moved with an air of challenge, making prolonged eye contact with neighbors and lingering near crime scenes as if to measure the reaction. Some victims reported an unnerving composure during the crimes, calm voices issuing instructions, violence deployed not in panic but as controlled enforcement. Material gain appeared secondary. While valuables were taken, the selection was inconsistent. In several incidents, items of greater worth were left behind, while personal or sentimental objects were removed, suggesting a psychological component to the choice, or the use of theft as a pretext for other actions. Their public image, maintained for years, began to erode. Linwood's earlier manslaughter conviction was known in some circles, and unexplained injuries, late-night movements, and new possessions without visible income drew attention. Within Highland Park, whispers of their involvement in more serious offenses grew louder, though few would confront them directly. Law enforcement began to note the clustering of certain crime types and the similarity of witness descriptions, a group of young black males operating as a unit, confident and unhurried. The presence of a younger accomplice in some reports was one of the first indicators of Meekins' active participation. By the opening months of 1979, the Briley's operations bore little resemblance to adolescent mischief. Incidents now carried a predatory element, victims selected for vulnerability rather than opportunity, the intrusion itself serving as both means and end. The escalation was not driven by necessity. The brothers were not impoverished to the point of desperation. Instead, the pattern suggests a growing compulsion toward domination, with theft, assault, and, soon, murder functioning as expressions of control. The year would see that compulsion fully unleashed. The bond that had once been defined by shared blood and a common address had transformed into an alliance organized for the execution of deliberate collective violence, one in which family ties served not as restraint but as reinforcement. The Briley brothers' 7-month sequence of killings in 1979 displayed neither a single motive nor a consistent victim profile. Instead, the spree revealed an opportunistic and escalating pattern, each incident marked by disproportionate violence and an absence of discernible restraint. Law enforcement records from the period chart a progression from targeted disputes to wholly random selection, with methods varying but brutality constant. William and Virginia Butcher were at home when the Brileys forced entry. The couple was bound and gasoline poured over them with the apparent intent to ignite. The attackers fled before the fire was lit, allowing the Butchers to escape. This incident marked the first recorded use of fire as a weapon in the spree, signaling a willingness to incorporate multiple instruments of harm. McDuffie, 23, was confronted on the street, assaulted, and fatally shot. The motive was unclear. No robbery was confirmed, suggesting a spontaneous act of lethal violence. The shooting was carried out at close range, and the victim was left where he fell, reinforcing the emergent pattern of public, unhidden attacks. Clark, 28, was killed during a dispute over drugs. While this incident carried a traceable motive, the level of force used exceeded the dispute's scale. Witnesses described multiple shots, delivered after the victim was incapacitated. The killing showed the Brileys' capacity to shift between impulsive street violence and premeditated execution. Gowan, 76, was raped and strangled in her home. Entry appeared forced, but valuables were left behind. The act combined sexual assault with lethal violence, indicating that control over the victim was the primary objective. The vulnerability of the target, an elderly woman living alone, mirrored a preference for minimal resistance. Phillips, 62, was attacked in his home. After being subdued, he was killed. By dropping a cinder block onto his head. This method marked a departure from firearms toward blunt force, applied with deliberate finality. The use of a heavy, on-scene object as the murder instrument indicated adaptability and comfort, improvising lethal means. Gallagher, 62, was abducted, driven to the James River, and shot before his body was dumped. Witnesses last saw him alive being forced into a vehicle. The abduction expanded the geographic scope of their operations, and the disposal of the body in a waterway suggested a partial, if ineffective, effort at concealment. Wilfong, 79, was beaten to death in her home. Multiple blunt instruments were used, consistent with frenzied or sustained assault. Entry was again forced, and items of value were ignored. The attack reinforced the recurring pattern of elderly, isolated victims subjected to excessive violence. In a shared residence, Garner, 79, and Page, 76, were murdered using a combination of blunt instruments and edged weapons. The brutality exceeded any requirement for subduing the victims. The killings took place in rapid succession, leaving the crime scene marked by multiple points of attack and redundant lethal injuries. Victims ranged from a young man in his 20s to elderly women in their late 70s, from acquaintances to total strangers. Selection was opportunistic, based more on availability and perceived vulnerability than personal grievance. Firearms, blunt instruments, strangulation, and attempted burning were all employed. Weapons were often improvised from the scene, indicating adaptability and a readiness to act with whatever means were at hand. The excessive force, multiple blows, redundant injuries, combination of methods, suggests a component of domination beyond the functional needs of the crime. Many killings occurred in or near the victim's own homes, sometimes in daylight, with little effort to prevent discovery. The sequence demonstrated a trajectory from targeted disputes to indiscriminate predation. By October 1979, the Briley brothers and Meekins were no longer engaging in crimes for material gain. The violence itself had become both the method and the objective. The killings of October 19, 1979, occurred less than 24 hours after J.B. Briley appeared before a judge and gave his assurance that he intended to avoid further trouble. That morning's promise to the court would stand in sharp contrast to the events of the night, a sequence that would become the most personally violating and publicly reviled crime of the Briley brothers' spree. Harvey Wilkerson lived only a short distance from the Briley residence. He was familiar with the brothers and aware of their capacity for violence. That evening, with Judy Barton, 8 months pregnant, and her young son at home, Wilkerson saw the Brileys approaching. According to testimony later provided by Meekins, Wilkerson appeared apprehensive but did not refuse them entry. In the close-knit geography of Highland Park, to turn them away might have been to invite retribution. Once inside, Linwood and J.B. asserted control immediately. The victims were ordered into a back bedroom. Barton was placed on the bed. Her son was positioned beside her. Wilkerson was made to sit separately. Duct tape and rope were used to bind hands and feet. Gags were applied. The measures were precise and methodical, consistent with the brothers' prior assaults. While Wilkerson and the child were restrained, Judy Barton was sexually assaulted. Court records note Meekins' testimony that Linwood initiated the rape, an act carried out while the other 2 victims remained bound in the same room. The sequence underscored the total erosion of boundaries that had once separated the Briley crimes from outright sexualized violence against known neighbors. Following the assault, Linwood produced a firearm, a .32 caliber revolver, consistent with weapons used in earlier killings. Harvey Wilkerson was shot once in the head at close range, the wound instantly fatal. Meekins testified that J.B. then took possession of the revolver. He fired a shot into Judy Barton's head, followed by a second shot into the head of her 5-year-old son. All 3 were killed in rapid succession, the shootings delivered with what one investigating officer later described as execution precision. The room showed minimal signs of struggle. Forensic photographs depict the victim still bound and gagged at the time of death. No valuables were taken. The television remained on. The absence of theft confirmed that material gain was not a motive. The killings were the terminus of an exercise in domination. The bodies were discovered soon after by a neighbor who had been asked to check on the family. Richmond police secured the scene, documenting 3 homicides within a confined space. The configuration of the bodies, Wilkerson slumped against the wall, Barton and her son side by side on the bed, was preserved in evidence photographs later shown in court. Duncan Meekins, arrested days later, would provide a detailed account. In sworn testimony, he described J.B. as calm during and after the shootings, while Linwood's demeanor remained detached, as though the events were routine. Investigators and prosecutors later identified the Wilkerson-Barton killings as the most depraved in the Briley brothers' record. The factors were cumulative. The victims were neighbors, known to the perpetrators. One was a pregnant woman, the other a young child. Sexual assault was committed in the presence of other restrained victims. No material motive existed. The crime's purpose appeared to be the assertion of total control and the extinguishing of witnesses. In sentencing arguments, the Commonwealth used this incident as the clearest demonstration that the Briley brothers' actions had progressed beyond criminal opportunism into predatory homicide, devoid of external necessity. A senior investigator later summarized, "By that night, there was nothing left to escalate to. The Wilkerson-Barton murders were not only a local tragedy, but a point of irreversible moral collapse in the Briley case file." In the measured language of the court record, they were capital in every respect, a confluence of premeditation, sexual violence, and the deliberate killing of a child. For the Richmond community, the crime confirmed that no relationship, no proximity, and no prior acquaintance could offer protection once the Briley brothers chose a target. Within days of the October 19, 1979 Wilkerson-Barton murders, Richmond police moved decisively. Investigative leads, including vehicle descriptions, witness timelines, and neighborhood intelligence, pointed back toward the Briley residence. Surveillance teams were deployed to monitor movements. The decision to act was accelerated by the recognition that the brothers had already demonstrated no hesitation in killing known associates, including women and children. Officers executed simultaneous arrest warrants for Linwood, J.B., and Anthony Briley. All three were taken into custody without exchange of gunfire. Duncan Meekins, apprehended shortly thereafter, was initially booked on the same homicide charges, with the Commonwealth signaling an intent to pursue capital prosecution against him as a full participant. In the weeks following the arrests, prosecutors identified Meekins as a potential leaver. At 17 years old during the spree, he was legally eligible for adult prosecution, but his age and his lower standing in the operational hierarchy gave the state room for negotiation. Investigators interviewed Meekins repeatedly. His first statements were partial, minimizing his role and knowledge. Over time, and under the advisement of counsel, Meekins began providing detailed accounts of each killing, including sequence of events, weapon use, and which participant had delivered the fatal act. These statements corroborated physical evidence and tied specific murders to specific brothers, critical under Virginia's capital statutes. At the time, Virginia law stipulated that the death penalty could be applied only to the triggerman, the individual who personally inflicted the fatal injury, except in cases involving murder for hire or certain conspiracy elements. This statute became central to the charging strategy. Meekins' testimony allowed prosecutors to separate the cases. Linwood was identified as the shooter in multiple killings, including Harvey Wilkerson. J.B. was identified as the shooter of Judy Barton and her 5-year-old son. Anthony's role was largely as an accomplice and participant in non-fatal acts of violence, making him ineligible for capital punishment under the triggerman rule. By anchoring each capital count to eyewitness testimony, the Commonwealth fortified its case against the two elder brothers while reserving life imprisonment for the youngest. In exchange for full cooperation, Meekins was offered a plea arrangement: life imprisonment plus 80 years. The life term ensured he would not be eligible for standard release, while the additional years functioned as a safeguard against parole shifts. His placement was further protected by transferring him to a facility outside Virginia under an alias to mitigate potential retaliation. The decision was not without controversy. Families of victims expressed frustration that a participant in the crimes could avoid execution. Prosecutors countered that without Meekins' cooperation, the evidentiary threshold for capital convictions would have been far harder to meet. The trials for Linwood and J.B. Briley were conducted separately, but followed a similar pattern. Jurors were presented with Meekins' testimony alongside physical evidence, ballistics, bindings recovered from scenes, and photographs documenting the injuries. The defense sought to discredit Meekins as self-serving, but cross-examination failed to dismantle the consistent alignment between his statements and the forensic record. Anthony Briley's proceedings were less contested. The evidence established his presence and participation, but absent direct involvement as the triggerman, the statutory maximum was life imprisonment. Linwood Earl Briley, convicted of capital murder in multiple counts, sentenced to death. James Dyrrell, J.B. Briley Jr., convicted of capital murder, sentenced to death. Anthony Ray Briley, convicted of first-degree murder and related charges, sentenced to life imprisonment. Duncan Eric Meekins, pleaded guilty to multiple counts under cooperation agreement, sentenced to life plus 80 years. The arrests and convictions marked the conclusion of the Briley's 1979 spree, but opened a protracted chapter in Virginia's penal history. Meekins' role, though contentious, became a textbook example in prosecutorial strategy, leveraging an insider to secure convictions under a statute with narrow capital applicability. The sentencing distribution mirrored the brothers' operational hierarchy: execution for those who delivered the fatal blows, life for the supporting participants. The precision with which the Commonwealth applied the triggerman statute in the Briley case would later be cited in legal commentary as both a demonstration of the law's clarity and a reminder of its constraints. In the end, The cooperation of one accomplice allowed the state to bring two of the most dangerous offenders in Richmond's history to the point of execution, while consigning the others to lifetime incarceration. By spring 1984, both Linwood and J.B. Briley had been confined on Virginia's death row for nearly 5 years. Security at Mecklenburg Correctional Center was considered among the most stringent in the state. The death row block operated under near total isolation. Despite this, investigative findings would later show that the Briley brothers had, over months, cultivated relationships with fellow inmates and exploited procedural gaps to plan a coordinated breakout. Sources within the facility later confirmed that Linwood acted as a central strategist. Conversations between cells, coded messages through recreation yard exchanges, and the enlistment of 4 additional death row inmates expanded the operational team to 6. The plan hinged on 2 vulnerabilities, first one being predictable shift patterns among correctional officers, and second, the ability to fabricate convincing restraints to simulate compliance during critical phases of movement. The group obtained improvised tools, sharpened metal, makeshift picks, and materials for false restraints, through a combination of smuggling and manipulation of inmate work assignments. On the evening of May 31st, the inmates overpowered guards during a scheduled movement period. Reports indicate that keys were taken and radios confiscated. The group used the guards' uniforms to disguise themselves, escorting each other through successive security checkpoints under the pretense of routine transfers. The ruse held long enough for them to reach a vehicle area outside the main perimeter. There, they took control of a prison transport van. At least one officer was confined inside a secure area to delay discovery. The vehicle cleared the outer gate before an alarm was raised, aided by the inmate's ability to provide plausible verbal identifications during challenge points. From Mecklenburg, the escapees split their travel. Initial intelligence suggested the Brileys intended to move north toward Canada, both to evade U.S. jurisdiction and to exploit any potential barriers to extradition in capital cases. Travel was conducted in stolen vehicles, changed frequently to reduce traceability. The Virginia State Police, U.S. Marshal Service, and FBI coordinated a multi-state manhunt. Flyers were distributed with updated photographs, and wiretaps were authorized on known associates' telephone lines. On June 8, 1984, 8 days after the escape, 2 of the escapees, Tuggle and Peterson, were captured in Vermont. Jones and Clanton were located in North Carolina shortly after. This left the Briley brothers as the final fugitives. The critical lead emerged from monitored telephone communications. A call placed to a female associate in Philadelphia was intercepted, revealing arrangements for temporary shelter. Surveillance teams converged on the residence. On June 19, 1984, tactical units surrounded the Philadelphia address. Linwood and J.B. were taken into custody without incident. Both were found unarmed, but in possession of cash, maps, and notations consistent with continued travel north. Interviews conducted immediately afterward indicated neither brother expressed remorse for the escape. Rather, they criticized its timing and logistical weaknesses. The escape prompted an immediate review of Virginia's death row protocols. Changes included stricter guard rotation, additional physical barriers between death row and vehicle access points, and reduced inmate contact during movements. For the Briley brothers, the escape represented the final assertion of defiance before the state carried out their death sentences. Linwood was executed 4 months later on October 12, 1984. J.B. followed on April 18, 1985. Neither publicly acknowledged regret for T. He escape, or the crimes that had placed them on death row. In the official after-action report, the Mecklenburg warden described the event as a calculated operation, executed with military precision by individuals with nothing left to lose. At age 30, Linwood Earl Briley became the first of the brothers to face execution. The location was Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond, the facility's death chamber prepared for the electric chair, a method retained by Virginia as its primary means of capital punishment. Prison records note that Linwood's final meal consisted of fried chicken, fried shrimp, and cake. He declined requests for a formal clergy visit, but accepted the presence of a spiritual advisor of his own choosing in the final hours. Witness logs indicate that at 11 p.m., Linwood was led from his holding cell to the execution chamber. His movement was described as steady and unresisting. Once seated in the oak chair, Straps were secured across his torso, arms, and legs. The standard wet sponge and copper helmet assembly were affixed to his shaved scalp. When prompted for a final statement, Linwood said, "I am innocent." The phrase was delivered without visible agitation. Observers noted no elaboration or explanation. The warden signaled, and at 11:05 p.m. the first current was applied. Official time of death was recorded minutes later by the attending physician. Media coverage the following morning emphasized both the brevity of his final words and the lack of visible emotion. Some outlets described the statement as an attempt at final defiance. Others recorded it without interpretation. J.B. Briley, 29 at the time of execution, remained on death row at Mecklenburg Correctional Center following his brother's death. In the months leading to his own execution date, J.B. entered into a marriage with a woman from outside the prison. Records confirm the ceremony took place within the facility under standard supervised visitation conditions. On April 17, 1985, J.B. declined a special last meal, choosing instead the standard institutional dinner served that evening. Interviews conducted by Prison Saint, AF noted a calm demeanor with no requests for special accommodations. Execution procedures began shortly before midnight. J.B. was escorted to the chamber wearing state-issued clothing. Once seated, he looked toward the observation area and, when offered the opportunity for a final statement, said, "Are you happy?" The question was repeated a second time. He then smiled faintly before turning his head forward. The warden initiated the procedure. Current was applied, and death was pronounced at 11:08 p.m. Witness accounts in the press described the smile as ambiguous, variously interpreted as taunting, ironic, or resigned. The executions concluded a legal process that had spanned less than 6 years from arrest to sentence fulfillment, an unusually swift timetable in capital cases, facilitated by the strength of eyewitness testimony from Duncan Meekins and the statutory clarity under Virginia's Triggerman rule. In courtroom commentary preceding the executions, prosecutors reiterated that the Wilkerson-Barton murders alone met multiple capital criteria, including the killing of a child and multiple victims in a single criminal episode. Defense counsel, while continuing to challenge aspects of the trial record, acknowledged that appellate options were effectively exhausted by early 1985. Public opinion in Richmond was divided along familiar lines, some viewing the executions as necessary closure, others questioning capital punishment as a remedy. National coverage emphasized the unusual fact of 2 brothers executed within 6 months for related crimes and the rare profile of their orchestrated death row escape less than a year before. Linwood's denial and J.B.'s rhetorical question shared a quality of performance, concise, memorable, and resistant to easy interpretation. Neither expressed remorse, offered apology to victims' families, nor acknowledged direct culpabilities. Tie. In the official record, both statements were transcribed without comment. From a procedural standpoint, both executions proceeded without technical complication. The Virginia Department of Corrections filed standard post-execution reports, noting compliance with all required safety and evidentiary protocols. For the Commonwealth, the Briley executions closed the legal chapter of one of the most lethal family-based crime sprees in state history. For those present in the observation rooms, the final moments of each brother reflected a consistent posture, controlled, unyielding, and absent the contrition many had anticipated, leaving the interpretive weight of their last words to the public record. The Briley brothers present a distinct challenge to criminological profiling. 3 siblings, close in age, raised in the same household, each progressing to participation in a sustained pattern of violent crimes, contrasted with a 4th brother who remained entirely outside the criminal justice system. The question of causation, why 3 followed a path into extreme violence while one did not, offers a limited but telling opportunity to examine the interplay of environmental conditions, possible genetic predispositions, and individual variation. The Briley household was headed by a father described as controlling and authoritarian, with a mother who maintained domestic order but was less publicly engaged. Reports indicate that the boys' shared bedroom was locked from the outside at night, an act that could be interpreted as excessive discipline or protective confinement. Research on authoritarian parenting suggests that high-control, low-warmth environments can increase the likelihood of covert defiance and antisocial behavior in adolescence. Baumrind, 1971, Patterson, 1982. The degree to which this structure created resentment or normalized dominance within sibling interactions remains an open point. Highland Park during the Briley childhood. Years was a transitional neighborhood, neither deeply impoverished nor affluent, but subject to economic and demographic shifts that reduced social cohesion. Opportunity structures for both pro-social and antisocial behavior coexisted. The brothers had access to education and basic material needs, but they also moved in an environment where minor delinquency could pass unnoticed by overextended authorities. The presence of exotic pets, snakes, tarantulas, piranhas, and the boys' documented enjoyment in feeding live prey to these animals introduced an element of normalized predation in the home setting. While the keeping of such animals is not inherently linked to violence, repeated exposure to and participation in acts of deliberate harm to living creatures is one of the recognized behavioral red flags in MacDonald's 1963 triad of early aggression indicators. Linwood's conviction for involuntary manslaughter at age 16, JB's juvenile incarceration for firing on police, and Anthony's later involvement in group criminal acts suggest early and repeated contact with correctional systems. Studies on juvenile violence, Farrington 1995, Lober, Stouthammer, Lober 1998, note that early offending combined with limited rehabilitative intervention often solidifies antisocial identity rather than correcting it, especially when offenders return to the same peer and family environment. Formal psychiatric evaluations of the Brileys are not publicly available, limiting any definitive diagnosis. However, behavioral descriptions, calm during acts of violence, lack of remorse in interviews, deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals align with certain markers of psychopathy as measured by the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, PCLR, including affective detachment, shallow emotional response, and manipulative interpersonal style. The contrast with the non-criminal brother raises impo, or tant variables, possible differences in temperament from birth, divergent peer associations, or an earlier break from the household environment. This aligns with findings that even in families with strong genetic predispositions toward aggression, environmental triggers and protective factors, such as alternative role models or avoidance of high-risk peer groups, can act as significant moderators. The question of heritability in violent criminal behavior has been examined in twin and adoption studies, Mednick et al. 1984, Rain 1993, which generally find that genetics can account for a significant portion of variance, but rarely in isolation. In the Briley case, shared genetic material and environment among the four brothers produced divergent outcomes, suggesting that while biological predisposition may have been present, individual experience and decision-making played decisive roles. By the time of the 1979 spree, the Briley brothers' violence had evolved into a coordinated group enterprise, suggesting reinforcement within the sibling unit. Mutual participation likely reduced individual inhibitions, consistent with the group violence facilitation model observed in criminological studies of gang and crew dynamics. The absence of such reinforcement in the non-criminal brother's life may have been a decisive protective factor. The Briley brothers' trajectory underscores that neither genetics nor environment alone can account for extreme criminal convergence among siblings. The combination of an authoritarian home, early exposure to predatory behavior, limited corrective intervention, and the mutually reinforcing presence of like-minded siblings created a closed system in which violence was normalized, rehearsed, and eventually operationalized. The presence of a non-offending sibling serves as a reminder that within even the most criminogenic family contexts, variance in personality, opportunity, and peer influence can alter the course of a life, toward survival or toward destruction. Following the executions of Linwood, October 1984, and J.B. Briley, April 1985, public attention did not vanish. For Richmond, the memory of the 1979 spree persisted in survivor accounts, law enforcement debriefings, and recurring media retrospectives. For the Commonwealth of Virginia, the case became a long-term reference point in capital prosecution strategy, correctional security, and risk assessment for violent offenders. Anthony Ray Briley, the youngest brother, received a life sentence in 1980 for his role in the spree. Convicted on first-degree murder and associated charges, he was ineligible for capital punishment under Virginia's Triggerman statute. Anthony's parole eligibility arose after serving the minimum term for life under state law, but each application, spanning multiple decades, was denied. Parole board statements cite the severity of his crimes, the continued impact on surviving victims' families, and the absence of compelling evidence of rehabilitation. As of the most recent public record, Anthony remains incarcerated, with no indication that release will be granted. His case is often cited in Virginia parole debates as an example of the tension between statutory eligibility and public safety concerns. Duncan Eric Meekins, whose testimony was instrumental in securing capital convictions for Linwood and J.B., entered into a plea agreement in 1980, life plus 80 years. In exchange, he provided detailed, corroborated accounts of each homicide, identifying the triggerman in each case and aligning his narrative with forensic evidence. Due to the risk of retaliation within the prison system, Meekins was transferred to an undisclosed correctional facility outside Virginia, living under an alias. Over the years, he has petitioned for parole, supported at times by legal advocates who emphasized his cooperation and relative youth at the time of the crimes. Nonetheless, parole boards have consistently rejected his release, citing the gravity of the offenses and his direct participation regardless of cooperation. His present location remains officially undisclosed for security reasons. The Briley case prompted significant procedural reforms in Virginia corrections and policing. The 1984 Mecklenburg escape exposed vulnerabilities in death row operations. Post-escape audits led to more restrictive inmate movement policies, revised guard rotation schedules, and added physical barriers between high-risk units and vehicle access points. Prosecutors refined methods for applying the Triggerman statute, ensuring that capital charges were supported by both forensic evidence and reliable eyewitness accounts. The ethical and strategic use of cooperating witnesses, especially in exchange for immunity from execution, became a more structured process, with greater emphasis on corroboration before offering plea deals. In the annals of U.S. criminal history, the Briley spree is notable for several reasons. Rare among spree and serial killers, the Briley case involved 3 siblings acting together over an extended period, with a 4th non-criminal brother as a point of contrast. The victims ranged from children to elderly individuals, across racial and socio-economic lines, suggesting an absence of a single victim profile. The brothers maintained a veneer of normalcy, living within the same neighborhood as many of their victims, blending into a familiar environment while engaging in extreme violence. Today, the Briley brothers are studied in criminal justice programs as a composite case, used to illustrate how sibling relationships can amplify deviance when combined with environmental reinforcement. Their progression from theft to sexual assault to multiple homicides is a clear example of violent trajectory theory. The 1984 escape remains a case study in prison break methodology and in the eventual failure points of fugitive operations. The Briley case continues to inform law enforcement, training and forensic analysis more than 4 decades later. It reinforces the principle that the convergence of familial loyalty, environmental opportunity, and unchecked early offending can produce a uniquely dangerous criminal entity. In parole hearings, courtroom discussions, and academic seminars, the name Briley functions less as a reference to individual offenders and more as a shorthand for a system-stretching test, one that combined high public fear, procedural complexity, and the rare spectacle of an entire sibling unit bound together by acts of lethal violence,